how do you go and get this AI for efficiency and productivity sorted out on these frameworks? Obviously, you've just touched on it a little bit, that you've got to make sure that the concerns are addressed in organizations. You don't want to go down that slippery slope where you start stifling innovation and actually becoming preventative for your organization's very ability to survive because the competition's moving ahead. But you also can't go too far the other way where it comes to light perhaps in future years. It wasn't intentional today, but you find out it was unethical. It was biased. The data was inaccurate. It did lead to huge bias in how you're dealing with people. You weren't able to delete people's data because once it's in the algorithm and the algorithm is trained, there's no way to go and reverse that because you don't know exactly how it works, and all the myriad of other issues that can come through. So how do you set that up to get that balance? And have you got any great examples at Standard Bank? I think it's a good question there from. Thanks, mate.
So it's a great question, and it is really hard to get the balance. So part of what we've done at Standard Bank, which might help bigger organizations if you're trying to look at deploy one of these frameworks, is to start in an incubated environment, because that enables you, and by that I mean pick one place where you can test this framework and you can get input. And you can get the right people around the table, the right mix of people, because that's pretty important here as well. You don't want a bunch of risk-averse lawyers. Similarly, you don't want a bunch of ONI. You don't want a bunch of ONI data scientists. You don't want a bunch of so you really want a nice mix of people who are coming with different lenses, different ideas, different views on what can make things work in the organization, and different views on what can cause you to fail. And then I think to incubate that in a smaller space and to test what you're doing is pretty useful. And then to test it against technology. So we are at the moment developing we're using an AI nudging technology, right? And I'm just using that as a small example. But you can then use that to start to test your framework against. And you want to work out, it's a great question, because if I say to you, my AI needs to be fair, what does that mean in practice? How do you test that? How do you work that out? And so these are the kind of things you can work out. Well, in this context, it means X or Y, and then you can start building out something around that. And ultimately, where you're trying to get to is something that's measurable. And Colin, you raised an interesting point there around, how do we make sure that we're staying on track and we're staying within the kind of boundaries where we need to be in without totally veering off piste. And I think these are just useful ways to come in and sense check yourself and measure whether what you're doing is actually practical before you scale it to a whole organization. So that model won't work everywhere. It won't work in smaller startups, but sometimes it's a good way to get something in and to start changing a culture and a mindset without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.